Hello, everyone. Our lecture here is on the Jewish sacred scriptures, the sacred text of Judaism, which would be the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible. Those are acceptable terms too, though the most commonly used term by Jews themselves for their own sacred text would be Tanakh. It would not be called the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a solely and exclusively Christian term. Jews refer to their sacred text as the Tanakh. Again, the Hebrew Bible and Jewish Bible, those are cited as well sometimes. I apologize, this worksheet has Tanakh listed here. I rarely see this spelling. The spelling I normally see is T-A-N-A-K. So both vowels would be A's, T-A-N-A-K. The reason for multiple spellings, variations to the spellings, is because Hebrew obviously used the language of Judaism, the indigenous language of the Jewish people, obviously has a different alphabet. So translating one language to another, when those different multiple languages use very different alphabets, you have to obviously determine what letter matches in one language with one alphabet to the other, to the matching letter of the other language that you're translating to in its alphabet. So that's why the discrepancy there. But I've normally seen T-A-N-A-K. With all that being said, the other reason for the discrepancy in spelling is because it's actually not even a word. It's not a word, to be honest with you, it's actually an acronym. Because there's three parts to the sacred scripture of Judaism. The T is the first part, which stands for Torah. The middle second part is Nevi'im, beginning with the letter N. And then the third and final part is Ketivum with a K. So it's actually an acronym, T-N-K. And then to make that acronym, those three letters representing those three parts resemble or look like a word, you can insert vowels. So Tanakh is actually just an acronym, T-N-K. If you want to make it resemble a word, you're free to do so. It's been done. It is done. T-A-N-A-K, Tanak. This has T-E-N-A-K. So I think I beat that to death. So the first part of the sacred scripture of Judaism called the Tanakh is obviously T. That's Torah. Torah means law, direction, or study in Hebrew. It's 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Christians sometimes call that the Pentateuch. Pentateuch is a Greek term meaning 5 scrolls, 5 writings. And then you have the middle section, and that would be Nevi'im, and that's prophets, 8 books. And then finally Ketivum, which would be the final section of 11 books, which just means writings itself. So all in total, 5 books of Torah or law, 8 books of Nevi'im or prophets, and 11 books of writings or Ketuvim would be 24 books total in the Tanakh. We can talk a little bit about some of these books. By far, it's not even close, the sacred core, the most important part of the Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, the most important part out of these 3 is the Torah. That's the most important part, the most sacred core. And it's these 5 books. Now, the books that you see listed here, from Genesis to Chronicles, Leviticus and Samuel, Job and Numbers, all these 24 books, these are obviously English terms that really come from the Greek. So if I were to list the terms of all 24 of these books from the Hebrew, some of you may not even recognize any of them. But I figured might as well just give it to you in the Greek, because these are the words you're more used to. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and so on and so forth. Obviously, these are English terms, but they come from the Greek. That's important to mention. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Tanakh, obviously that comes from Hebrew. So these 24 books, the most sacred core is the Torah, Pentateuch. we can talk about these individually since it's the most important part. Let me scroll down to a future sheet here. So Genesis means birth or beginning in Greek. It does talk about God, Yahweh, Elohim, Adonai, different terms used. We can take all 50 chapters of Genesis and divide it into two basic parts. The first 11 chapters, which go over the first 11 chapters, which go over primeval history. Primeval just means like first time. That's actually literally what it means. Evil is time, EVAL, time or ages. You probably heard of medieval. That's middle time or middle ages. What comes before medieval times is primeval time. So the era of the first part of history. So it goes over creation. Genesis 1, 2, and 3 go over creation with the two different cosmogonies, the two creation stories, right? That we talked about earlier in the course. Early part in the course itself. So with the first part with days, and the second part with the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, the serpent, and then falling victim to the temptation to eat from that forbidden fruit, and then cast out of the garden. And then it continues on with it, Cain and Abel, and Seth, and eventually the Tower of Babel, the Noah flood stories. That's all Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis 12 through 50 is matriarchal history. Genesis 12 begins, boom, right with the call of Abraham. And it continues down with his wife Sarah, their son Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah. They have Esau and Jacob. Jacob has the 4 wives, Rachel, Leah, and their 2 servants. And with those 4 wives, he has 12 sons, with Joseph being the most favored and obviously the one that receives the most attention. It does end with, in Genesis 50, or eventually in Genesis 50, with Jacob reuniting with his son Joseph, and then Jacob dies, and they're all living in Egypt because of that famine was so disastrous, and Joseph was doing so well, so they stay in Egypt. And that, of course, introduces Egypt in this history here of the Jews. Exodus continues that story right along. Exodus is Greek for exit or departure. Basically, Moses is now a couple generations after the patriarchs. He's going to lead the deliverance out of Egyptian slavery and tyranny. So he's the liberator. And with the whole 10 plagues, the slavery is ended. Finally, with the death of the firstborn male child in every Egyptian household. And they march back to the promised land eventually, but they have to stop at Mount Sinai to give formal gratitude and thanks to God for everything that God has done, including, again, enter into human history again to free them. So Moses receives the 10 commandments, and you have that whole Mosaic covenant. Follow these 10 laws, these 10 commandments, and national prosperity and blessings will ensue. Violate those 10 laws, and national catastrophe and disaster. So Exodus introduces Moses and the Mosaic covenant of the 10 commandments. Genesis had that Abrahamic covenant. This land will be for you and for yours forever. Your descendants will be as numerous as the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky. Leviticus is where you have a lot of the laws relating or pertaining to the Levites. Levi was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, Israel, thus an older brother to Joseph. This was the priestly tribe. Their obligations to leading liturgical, ritualistic material, ethical purity, cleaning of clean versus unclean actions in every part of life. Everything. From food, private behavior, public behavior, leading of rituals and ceremonies and obligations and holy days, blood, the sacrifices, conduct, the calendar, maintenance of the temple, and again, sacrifices, everything. It's not a very narrative book. It's not narrative or storytelling. It's mostly just, priestly material, laws after law after law, how to celebrate different holy days, things like that, for sure. About 1/3 of the laws are listed in the book of Leviticus. So most people know that Jews have 10 laws, the 10 commandments, and that kind of spills over into Christianity. But God didn't stop with 10 laws. God added. God continued to give Israel laws to follow. In fact, God gave 603 additional laws on top of the 10 commandments, obviously for 613 total. These laws are listed. We didn't just come up with the number 613. They're listed in the book of Leviticus. A big portion of them are. So, and then we have the book of Numbers. A book of Numbers. Why is there a book called Numbers? Because it begins the numbering of the people. A census, counting all the people, all the 12 tribes as they're marching out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, through the Sinai Peninsula, through the desert, back to Israel, back to the Promised Land. It's a lot of the wandering itself, a lot of the wandering. The older generation, they will all pass away. They'll all die for not keeping the younger generation faithful on that march back to the Promised Land, which took 40 years of wandering in the Sinai wilderness. Should have taken 2 to 3 months. Takes 40 years. The older generation couldn't keep the younger generation faithful and obedient to God. There was constant complaining and grumbling, and some even advocating that they should just go back to Egypt. At least they had food and shelter. They were slaves, but rather than die in the desert. So the older generation will die away. They will all die. And then Deuteronomy, the final book of the Torah, so kind of serves as a conclusion. It fully reviews and recaps Torah. So that's why it's called Deuteronomy. Deuteros nomos. Deuteros nomos in Greek. Deuteros is second. Nomos is law. So it's just a restatement of the law. Not as second as opposed to the first, just second as in a restatement of the first. The basic organizing paradigm of the book of Deuteronomy is Moses' 3 farewell speeches to the new generation of Israelites that are getting ready to enter the Promised Land. He sits atop a cliff top and he dies as he witnesses them marching back into the Promised Land itself. So it reviews all of Jewish history, including their Hebrew ancestors and all the laws, their covenantal relationship with God. So that's Torah, the sacred core of the Hebrew Bible. You have 613 laws that are written here, mostly in Leviticus, but you have some in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The large portions of those books are written around 800 to 600 BC. Do those laws reflect the original time in which they were written and revealed? Probably. Just as if we were to write a law, it really is going to reflect current culture and societal norms as well too. So are some of the laws outdated? Are they intrinsically connected to the original time period and there's really no separation, but time has gone by? This is where rabbis, they struggle with that. How do you answer that question? How do you follow some of these laws, which seem to be somewhat outdated for some people? So rabbis, they wrote the Mishnah, which is basically commentary of the law. Rabbis or masters or teachers, they knew the law and they kind of provided a commentary explanation. And then they wrote another one called Gemara, which means supplement, and those two together are called the Talmud. So the Talmud is a writing by rabbis to help explain how you can follow all the laws in your life today. So that's called the Talmud. The most important word here, you can kind of disregard Mishnah and Gemara, focus on Talmud. That's an important writing for some Jews, though not all. Not all. So that's the Torah. Then we have Nevi'im. I'm sorry, Nevi'im. I always say that word wrong. Nevi'im. Just not scrolling up. Nevi'im, which is 8 volumes. We can divide it into 2 different groups. Basically, the first group is the former prophets, which is the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. These basically continue the story. So Joshua kind of takes over, and he helps lead the Israelites, the Hebrews, back into the Promised Land. Judges is the book of Shophets, the book of Judges. It kind of continues the history with the 12 tribes reorganizing, reconstituting themselves. It's a loose organization. There's really nothing on earth that sits on top of the 12 tribes to organize them. So 12 judges spontaneously rise to the occasion to try to unite everyone together again. Doesn't prove successful. So with the high priest Samuel, eventually a monarchy is established with Saul as the first king, and then David, and then Solomon, and then Solomon dies in 922, and there's a civil war. Israel, the chosen blessed nation of God, splits into two. A rival kingdom of the north, called Israel, of 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom of in the south of 2 tribes called Judah. And it goes, so there's all these kings. There's one queen actually too. That goes over the history of all that, the rival kingdoms in the north and the south, and their captivities, their exiles, their enslavements and deportations, since the north falls to Assyria in 722, and the southern kingdom of Judah falls to the Babylonians in 587. Goes over all that history in Samuel and Kings. And then the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, those would be major prophets, meaning what they wrote is extensive and long. Isaiah is like 66 chapters. That's a long book. Jeremiah and Ezekiel are close to 40 each. And then one book called the 12 of the Minor. The book of the, I'm sorry, it's called the Book of the 12. My apologies. The Book of the 12. It's 12 minor prophets, minor in the sense that what they wrote is not nearly as extensive as to what Isaiah in 66 chapters, Jeremiah in close to 40, and Ezekiel in close to 40 wrote individually. In fact, if you add up all the chapters of all 12 of those books, the 12 minor prophets, you would get 67 chapters, where again Isaiah 66, interestingly enough. Jews collectively call that one book. Christians, if you're a Christian, you actually keep them as 12 separate books. So you don't need to know them, but if you spell out Noah, so it's Nahum, Obadiah, Amos, and Habakkuk, and then 2 more H's, Haggai and Hosea, and then 2 J's, Jonah and Joel, and then 2 M's, Malachi and Micah, and then 2 Z's, Zephaniah and Zechariah. Actually, I'm sorry, it's listed right here. These are listed in a different order, but I memorized them by spelling out Noah, and then 2 H's, 2 J's, 2 M's, 2 Z's. So your former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and then your latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, those are major, and then the book of the 12 minor prophets. Jews count them as one book. Christians are 12 individual books. So there's your Nevi'im, the prophets. Those Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, in the book of the 12, it just goes over more history of the northern and southern kingdoms. Some of these prophets are northern prophets. Some of these prophets are southern prophets. It goes over these kings. It helps theologically explain history for the Jews. Why did those bad things happen to the Jews, including the Assyrian captivity and the Babylonian captivity, where the Jews were conquered, viciously conquered by the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, and those that survived were enslaved and marched to Nineveh, the Assyrian Empire, and then later the Babylonian Empire, and enslaved for generations. So it helps explain that as well in a theological sense. Why did this happen? And then some of these are read by the rabbi during Shabbat, during Sabbath, during the holy day, weekly celebration for Jews coming together in the synagogue. Some of these prophetic readings match in terms of what's being discussed with a reading from the Torah. This matching is called Haftarah. There's your bottom point there. And then finally, Ketivum is the third and final section of Tanak. It just means writings. It's 11 books. These are some of the more poetic writings. You have 150 Psalms. Virtually everyone in Western culture knows Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And maybe another line from Psalm 23, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are at my side. So some of you may recognize that. That's Psalm 23. Proverbs are short, pithy, wisdom sayings, advice itself too. Um, some people recognize the short wisdom sayings. Job is that book about that poor guy named Job who is perfect, innocent, guiltless, blameless, and who goes through so many horrific things in life with the loss of his family and property, his wealth, and his own health as well, because of this wager between God and Satan to see if Job will turn away from his faithfulness if all these horrible things happen to him. And of course, Job never does. Job always remains faithful to God. Song of Songs is an interesting book. Songs of Solomon, Song of Songs almost didn't make it into the Bible, into the Tanak, the Hebrew Jewish Bible. It rarely discusses God, and it's just to be direct, it's quite sexual. It's quite erotic. It kind of celebrates that form of love. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Ruth is a short, beautiful book about a special bond that a daughter-in-law has with her mother-in-law, and how they remain together even though the son dies. The son dies, but the mother and daughter-in-law stay together. Where you go, I will follow. Between Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi. Lamentations is a book that is obviously very appropriately named. It goes over very painful low points in Jewish history and how the Jews have survived and endured. Ecclesiastes is a philosophical wisdom book about life and its purpose. Esther is a rousing national patriotic book to discuss how Queen Esther revealed her Jewish identity and ethnicity to her husband Xerxes, the king of the Persian Empire, and how she saved the Jews from extermination and genocide against the evil general Haman with the help of her own uncle Mordecai. So the very gallows that the general Haman had built to exterminate the Jews are the gallows that he himself has hung, based off Queen Esther's intervention and plotting and planning and all that. Excuse me. Um, and then Daniel is probably the final book to be written itself. Um, it's somewhat prophetic. It goes over. It's probably along the same time period as of when the Jews overthrow Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and thus drive out the Seleucid dynasty, which ushers in an era of over 100 years of independence and local rule and autonomy. Ezra and Nehemiah is one book for the Jews. It goes over history of how the Jews returned back to their Holy Land following the end of the Babylonian enslavement, once they were freed by Cyrus the Great when he conquered the Babylonian Empire and established the Persian dominance, Persian rule in the Middle East. And Chronicles kind of does that same kind of historical overview, though it goes further back in history than Ezra and Nehemiah does itself. So Ezra and Nehemiah and Chronicles are historical writings, but they're put in the final part of Tanakh because they're late. They're written last, along with Daniel. 5 of these books are part of the Megillat. The Megillat is like festival scrolls, 5 scrolls that are read during certain holy days in Judaism, which will be a later objective. But Song of Songs is read during Passover, Ruth during Shavuot, Lamentations during the basically celebration to remember the temple being rebuilt, Ecclesiastes during Sukkot, and Esther during Purim itself. So those 5 are collectively called the Megillat, 5 scrolls. Here is just how it's just written in another way for you. And you can see Tanak, T-A-N-A-K, sometimes with an H. And again, the more dominant way I've seen is just T-A-N-A-K itself. So the 5 books of Torah, the 8 books of Nevi'im, and the 11 books of Ketivum. These 3 points are interesting. Again, we talked about the Pentateuch, but it's 1 book of Samuel, 1 book of Kings, and then Ezra and Nehemiah is also 1 book. Christians have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Ezra is a book that's separate from Nehemiah. So Christians and Jews do kind of count these books differently. And obviously, the book of the 12 is 1 book for Jews, but 12 separate books for Christians. It's 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, because when you translated Samuel out of the Hebrew and into Greek, you needed a 2nd scroll, because that's how long that book is, and for your translation. Same thing with Kings. So that's just those points there. We talked about the 5 books of Torah. For the Old Testament, just some more history here for you. Those 5 books of Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The dominant theory by biblical scholars is that basically those 5 books were written by 4 different groups of people, 4 different scholars, probably camps or groups of people. You have these 4 camps. Scholars name them the J school, the E school, the D school, and the P school. The J just refers to the group that preferred the term Yahweh or Jehovah, hence J. They're the oldest writers from like the 900s BC, and they're from the south. The E school preferred Elohim for the divine, God, so around 900, 800 BC, and they wrote in the north. The D school wrote the book of Deuteronomy around 600, 620, 600 AD, and then the P school, the priestly school, wrote around 500 BC. So they were the latest, the last, the most recent, and so they served as the final editor or redactor. They kept all the older writings from the J school, the E school, and the D school, inserted their own writings, and they put everything together in that format of 5 books. So they wrote, but then they were the editor too and wove everything together. That was completed somewhere around 400 BC. Deuteronomy, again, was written around 620 BC. King Josiah institutes temple repairs, renovations, and just general reforms, and that's when the book of Deuteronomy is discovered. So that's how we can kind of pinpoint that one. And then Nevi'im is written around the Jewish exile by the Babylonians, and those are finalized around 200 BC. Ketuvim was written around, they were written earlier, but they were final form, no further revisions or redactions, around 90 AD by a council of rabbis coming together in the city of Jamnia. And they probably assembled the whole Tanak that we have today as it is assembled, with 5 books of Torah, 8 books of prophets, Nevi'im, and 11 books of writings or Ketuvim. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible began in the city of Alexandria in northern Egypt in the 3rd century BCE, and that became important for Christians. And then don't worry about the Vulgate, the Latin. No, you don't need to worry about that. If you want to know more about the 4 different schools, J, E, D, and P, there are these sheets here that give you individual outline points about those 4 and some examples. So you can see the different writing styles. But again, the P school is the last one. They serve as the final editor or redactor, putting everything together in what we have today in the 5 books of Torah. All right, everyone, that is our lesson on Jewish scripture, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible. Have a great day.